The KRC Farm and Food Conference was held on November 16th and 17th in Wichita, Kansas. The theme was Framing Our Future: What is Right About Food, Farming, and Communities in Kansas. I would like to introduce Saturday afternoon keynote speaker Ann Bikle, biologist and co-author, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. Her topic is the hidden half of nature.
This book, The Hidden Half of Nature, is very much sort of an odyssey that started in our backyard in Seattle. And I've been pushing for a garden big time when we were in the house hunting mode. And little did either one of us realize that sort of my desire to have a garden would lead us into this deep exploration of microbiomes. So microbiomes are the microbial communities that you find in the soil. They're native to their particular soil or their particular host organism, which is a person, a dog, a cat, a fish. Just about every living thing has its own microbiome. And so this book was the beginning of our journey, not only into the soil, but into this whole other world. And so my talk today is going to sort of focus on microbiomes and what it means for plants and people, for agriculture, and for medicine. All right, so I'm just going to get going here. And these are our protagonists, and I'm sure most of you out there are familiar with these microorganisms. The one you might not be quite so familiar with is this guy over here in the upper left. This is called an Archaea. And when microbiologists first found this organism, they thought, it's probably a bacterium. It's one-celled, it's too small to see. That's sort of your common definition of a microorganism. But then they did genomic analysis on Archaea and found that they predated bacteria, and they're a very unique life form. So this is sort of the tale of the microbial world over and over again. When you think you have them figured out, some new piece of information comes up and sort of upends your worldview of microorganisms. And this happened in the world of biology and microbiology in the 1970s and 80s with this particular character. And fungi up here, people say fungus is a microorganism. Well, there's a lot of different kinds of fungi, and yeasts, for example, the yeasts that ferment grapes into wine, milk into yogurt, and so on. Yeasts are one-celled organisms. And even a mushroom that we may see above ground, what's known about the structure of their cells is that their cells are not completely closed off from one another. So their cytoplasm is flowing like a river throughout that entire fungal body. So in some senses, even the mushrooms are one-celled. All right. And because these organisms are small, and because we're these big creatures with eyes, and we're very biased toward what we can see, I always like to put this up to give you a sense of scale about the microbial world. And the way this works is that each column here, the column to the right is 10 times, means that thing is 10 times larger than the thing to the left. So what that means is a bacterium is 10 times larger than a virus. A chloroplast, which is a hugely important thing for plants to be able to photosynthesize, is 10 times larger than a bacterium, and so on. And a red blood cell's not a microorganism, but as cells go, it's really quite a large cell. And then you come over here to the visible realm, and you can see sort of the same thing going on. So fully half, actually it's actually more than half, but we couldn't write the book, more than half of nature. So that's why we stuck with the hidden half. But the reality is really most of nature, more than half, is hidden from our view. And that makes it challenging sometimes to understand everything that the microbial world can do. All right, so the house. This was the house in Seattle that we bought. And Norwegians built our house 100 years ago in 1918. And this is no offense to any Norwegians out there, but I will just say this. Norwegians did not come from a gardening country. At our place, whatever sort of blew in on the wind and the rain, and in Seattle most everything is green, you leave it there because why fight it? It looks okay, you're not a gardener. So the Norwegians left us with sort of a hodgepodge of a yard. For one thing, there's this lawn area, which maybe to to Kansans, oh gosh, that's nice and green. Well, it is green, that's true, but it's just not very biologically rich or biologically interesting. So this is what I had my eye on. This was going to be a garden, okay? And I began scheming and dreaming. These are actually photographs. I made a montage, and I drew all over them. What could this garden be? What might it look like? How would we use it? Which direction was the sun coming from, the wind, and so on. And so I spent a good deal of time drawing all over photographs. And at one point, I think Dave and I were talking about them. He said, yeah, crazed ransom notes from a botanist. That's what that looks like to me. Oh, okay. I have to agree, it did look a bit like that. So here we were, dreams and schemes, and then the day finally came to get plants in the ground. What I'm not showing you is off to the side here, there are many, many plants in pots that I had been collecting for 6 to 12 months prior to breaking ground for the garden, and they desperately wanted out of their pots, and I desperately wanted them out of their pots. But then in August, and August is a very hot month and a very dry month in Seattle, this was where we landed with our project. And I looked at this soil and I said, oh, a gardener's dream. No. This soil is the color of a pair of khaki pants. It really is soil that the glaciers, when they descended down out of Canada into the Puget Sound area, they dragged all these rocks and sand and gravel and a little bit of soil. And that was mostly what we were working with. So we had not really intended to do this wholesale clearing of our lot, but we did. And there was, the good and the bad about that is we came up close with our soil. And I took one look at this, and then I panicked because I have all of these plants over here. I've got this soil that, this is no Midwestern prairie soil, folks. It has a hard pan, a natural hard pan that's called glacial till, which if you've ever run into that with a shovel, it sort of sends a zing back up your arm. It's a bit like concrete. And we had that, and we still have that, about 8 inches down or so. But in any event, what my gut told me, because I had done enough gardening, and I thought organic matter, I need organic matter quick, it needs to be cheap or free, and it needs to be close by. So this was the beginning of my education as a gardener that I call the Organic Matter Chronicles. And the first thing that I did when I entered the Chronicles was to get a wheelbarrow and paint it up with flames to make everything move faster. And in retrospect, what I really should have painted on this wheelbarrow was microorganisms. And I'm due for a new wheelbarrow, and so maybe that'll be my winter project, is to get the microbes painted on to the new wheelbarrow. So I mentioned organic matter, and this was a few years, this was after this first summer and fall, and I began collecting organic matter, like I said, just about anywhere I could. And these are some of the examples. One of my favorite things is wood chips that come off of arborist trucks. Seattle is a tree forested area, and so arborists are always pruning trees, or a tree's fallen down in a storm, and so they're looking for places to put all of those wood chips. And so I said, why don't you put them in our driveway, please? So, 10 yards at a time, wood chips came in. And I would mix those wood chips with other things, because wood chips, everything up here, the N means it's a nitrogen source, C means it's a carbon source. And wood chips are really a carbon source, and so I was mixing those up with nitrogen sources. And this is an interesting thing. People say, well, do you have animals on your lot? It's like, well, we're not that intrepid. Some people in Seattle have goats. Exactly was I doing with all of that organic matter? I was making mulch mixes. Because the other thing that was going on in Seattle in that very first summer when August was so hot was watering. And I did not want to be a slave to the hose. I wanted to keep our water costs down. So my reason for all of this mulching and organic matter was both to feed the soil, but also to keep watering costs down. So this particular mulch mix, hinoki is a kind of evergreen that we now have in the garden. That's right. This is the neighbor's hydrangea bouquet that she gave me, so we enjoyed that for a couple days. And then how I think is, that's organic matter. That is going into some mulch mix. And then from our own garden, and this is years later, because initially the garden was not producing much biomass. I mean, plants were small, and they just weren't big enough to, you know, get any appreciable organic matter from. But later on, these are dogwood shrub leaves. This is off of our maple. This here is the hinoki. Here we've got a sword fern. So whenever I'm pruning and clipping, I just get all this stuff, and I have a little area that I stash it all in. And so then when I go to make my mulch mixes, I grab some of this, I grab some of that. It's sort of like a soup or a stew for the soil in a way. I never use exactly the same ingredients because I never have exactly the same ingredients. And so it's sort of a creative thing. It's like you open up the refrigerator and you say, what's in here to eat? And that's sort of how I go about my mulch mixes. With the one reminder, I always like to mix all of this in with wood chips. And I like to leave, if I can, I like to leave the wood chips sitting around for 6 months or so, so that I get fungi start inoculating those wood chips, and I mix them up. All right, and then the last thing, the wood chips. So people also say, oh, do you dig all of that in? No, that's like backbreaking. I did that when I was younger, and that was stupid, and it was hard. I just lay this stuff on the top of the soil, and organisms come up from the soil. They're like, you know, to them, this is like a bone is to a dog. You lay it out, they come and get it. It's easy and it's convenient that way. I also did compost teas. We started a worm bin several years after we put the garden in, and worm compost is one of the finest composts I think that there is. And it makes a great, there's a little sack here, and that's where I've taken the worm compost, put it in this sack. This is an aerator, and I put a nutrient solution in. And then this is what I either do foliar applications with a sprayer on plants, or I water it in. And it's sort of a labor-intensive process, but you look at your plants, you know, about a week later, and you're like, that was the worm compost. And you'll see flushes of growth, or you'll see a pest or a pathogen problem that starts to clear up. And so, lo and behold, here I am, layering all this stuff on, mixing up all of these mulches, and as it goes in a garden, you're inevitably moving plants around, or Dave and I had second thoughts about something, so we start to dig around the soil, and what we noticed after about 3 or 5 years is that we had built up this darker layer here of soil. This is one of my mulch mixes on top, and it's sitting on top of this glacial till. And we thought, wow, who'd have thunk that you could change soil that rapidly? Because after all, you know, it takes nature, depending on where you are, more or less around a century or so to build about an inch of soil. So this is when we sort of sat up and took notice of what some of my gardening practices were doing. All right, so if this is happening places that we can see and on top of the soil, I want to share what it looked like, you know, after some years of doing all of this. Now, farmers have crops, but gardeners have crops too. And my crops are maple trees. I've got them in the ground. I've got them in pots. They're a thing that's really easy to grow in Seattle. There's a lot of different kinds, and it's a whole lot of fun to have all of these little trees. So I have crops of maples. This, I don't know if you recall from that first slide of that bare soil, this is the neighbor's garage, and it's actually even more obscured these days. And of course, big leafy greens. This is the veg garden that we put in after we put the main garden in. This is a hinoki. This is another great tree called a Persian ironwood, or a Perodia persica. Nice big fat green leaves that I like to use in my mulches, and like wonderful fall color as well. And the eco lawn. So lawns can be, some people are really down on lawns. Some people are, well, I'm not so sure about that. I like a place where we all like somewhere where that plant is short and it's green and we could go lay down on it and we can walk across it in our bare feet. I don't think there's anything wrong with a lawn, and I figured out a way to grow a lawn that doesn't require chemical inputs and fertilizers, and it's selecting the grass species for your region and letting them grow how they want to grow. So we're cool season, wet kind of climate. So there's a cool season grass in here. This is in the early spring. This is when the lawn looks its best. This is English daisy. There's some other herbaceous plants in here. There's some forget-me-nots, and there's yarrow, and there's red clover. And I like the clover because it's a nitrogen fixer. And, every now and then I'll get compost in the fall, and I'll just sort of sprinkle it around on the lawn. But the other reason I love my lawn is not just because of how it looks, but this is a great nitrogen source for my mulch mixes. So I let it get high, 4 or 6 inches, and then I mow it, and then I take all of that stuff, and it becomes part of my organic matter stash for making mulches. And of course, flowers. The highlight of a garden in the summertime is flowers, in my opinion, and vegetables. And so the season always seems too short, but anyway, flowers are what brings so much life and vitality and dynamism to a place, and that's because it's drawing all of these insects, right? And so you start to see all of these connections between the plants and between animals. Speaking of which, so I was doing all this heavy lifting. That's right, I was laying down all of this mulch, but who was really doing the work were soil organisms. And when you hear the term soil microbiome, I found it interesting. A soil scientist was saying, hey everybody, with the word micro in front of the biome part, let's not forget that life in the soil goes from things like this, these chewers and chompers, to these grinders, our earthworms, clear down to the microorganisms. So I don't like to sort of split the soil food web up and leave out some of these larger organisms because they serve a purpose. You can picture organic matter coming into a garden. First the funnel is really, really big, and then organisms gradually reduce the size, the physical size of all these different kinds of organic matter to make it the right quality, the right characteristic, and the right setting for the microbes to start working on it. And what we have here, this is a clump of bacteria. This is a root hair. These are fungal spores, and this is their hyphae, these barely visible thread-like things just coating and swatting that root hair. This is a microarthropod. Probably you could see that if you had a really, really good eye. And then this is a nematode. And the way it works with the microorganisms, bacteria in particular, are really interesting. Sure, they're only a single cell, but proportionately speaking, their bodies are rich in nitrogen. So when you get bacterial feeding nematode, which is what this organism is, chowing down on bacteria, that manure is really rich in nitrogen. And the neat thing about that is all of that manure is getting put right where the plant wants it, which is right around the roots, and that's where the gardener wants it, or the farmer wants it too. So when you have high populations of bacteria, that is a food source for many, many other things, and the manure that comes out of those critters is rich in nitrogen. So in essence, this is manuring the soil from the inside out. It would be as though, imagine if you could shrink your cows down, get them down into the soil, have them cruise through there, do their manuring, and come back up. And I realize that many of us sort of know, because we work around plants, you're a farmer, you're a gardener, you get sort of, oh yeah, that's right, this is how plants eat. But I always like to review this because I think it's somewhat astonishing that a plant's green body, through things from the atmosphere, nitrogen, carbon, through things from itself, organic matter, through things from this earth, rocks and water, it grows this green body that we eat some of them, we marvel over some of them, they hold our landscapes together. It's really something. I mean, we don't feed ourselves with ourselves. We're not, we're using oxygen out of the atmosphere, but we're not able to eat rocks. So this is a really, I think, just a really neat thing about the botanical world, how it is they've managed to persist on our planet for so long. But there's one other thing that a plant's green body needs, and it's a source of food and nutrients that most people don't think about as a fundamental part of the plant diet. And where all this activity is happening is in a place called the Rhizosphere. And that is this zone very, very close around a plant's root system, maybe nanometers to centimeters or so. You can picture it like a halo all around the roots of a plant. And what's happening in the Rhizosphere is that the plant is putting out compounds and molecules called exudates. And what's more astonishing is that a plant uses somewhere around 40% of its energy, all of this hard-earned work that it's doing, 40% of its energy to manufacture these exudates. And these exudates are things like sugars, fats, and proteins, and they push that out into the Rhizosphere. So sugars, fats, and proteins, that's meals. And that's meals for microbes. That's what is going on. So far I've just talked about the plant giving food away to its root microbiome. But it's also getting something back in return. And so this is an enlarged image just of a root hair. You've got bacteria, you've got fungi, and what you have, these exudates are going out, these bacteria are consuming those exudates, because that is really good fare down there in the soil. You just buddy up with the root, and you have meals coming all the time. And like any organism, bacteria excrete waste products after they consume those exudates, but they're not really waste products. We really need to get that term out of our mind. They're metabolites. These are compounds and molecules that come out of the bodies of bacteria, and they're things like plant growth promoting hormones. So a plant is relying on the microbial world for its hormones for just normal growth and development. Fungi, it turns out, prospect. Say our plant is over here on the wall and the fungi is way over here beyond the root system, scouring around and mining various things out of the soil, one of which is phosphorus, which we know that's the P of NPK. There's a lot of it sitting there in the soil that certain forms of fungi, they go get, they put it inside their fungal hyphae, and they transport it back to the plant, and they hand that over, that phosphorus over, and they get exudates in exchange. So this is another really, really important part of the plant diet that until recently we haven't known a lot about, and we certainly haven't known quite how important it is. And something else that exudates can do, you have an herbivore that starts munching on a leaf up here above ground, and that plant sends signaling molecules down to the root system that its root microbiome will sense, and it tees up the root microbiome to produce yet another metabolite that the plant takes up that activates the plant's immune system and its defense system, because it wants this herbivore off its back and on to some other plant's back. So it's this whole system of communication and interaction that is really going on between plants and their root microbiome. And so when you think about it, there's different kinds of, people have different kind of diets. Plants, crops, ornamentals can also have different kind of diets. In a fertilizer diet, we've all seen the power of fertilizers. You get a really nice buff-looking plant above ground, or you can at least. It's pretty amazing. But underground, if we could see what that looks like, you get sort of an anemic, paltry-looking root system. And what this means is there's hardly any exudates coming off of these roots, and that means microbial populations and all of the other things that they do are not really happening on a fertilizer diet. And so, in contrast, soil health diet, you really want to think of it in terms of feeding the things that are the foundation of health for the crop or the plant. And I'll just draw your attention to, it's sort of opposite. The largest arrow in the fertilizer diet is all of these big macronutrients, and down here on a soil health diet, all that organic matter, you get a root system that's really robust, and it's growing like crazy, and exudates are pouring out, and it's a ceaseless exchange in that biological bazaar of the rhizosphere. And so diet can have big implications for the health of plants and crops is really the main point here. And people think, oh, you know, all that organic matter, that's just not going to grow my plant enough. But it's a perfectly adequate amount of NPK. And you want all of those other metabolites that a plant needs. Because a plant not only needs to grow, it needs to defend itself from pests and pathogens. These days, with weird weather and temperature everywhere, that's also something that plants sort of have to beef up for. And so all of this signaling with their root microbiome helps in that way. And so we often think that, right, we're upright, vertical beings, and the brain is up here above ground. And we associate with plants mostly their above ground parts. But really, the truth is this. Really, the brain of the plant is that root system underground. And that is really sort of the way we ought to all be, I think, thinking about things and remembering things too. All right, so what we have here is, this is not much of a microbiome down here. It's sort of a dead soil. Here in a live soil, all of these microbial populations. And what this means is that in the botanical world, the root is not just sort of the gut, the sort of the nutrient acquiring part of the plant's green body. It's the thinking part, it's the intelligent part too. And what this all means is this. The smartest plant is over here communicating and interacting with all of its root microbiome members. All right, we're going to take a twist now. So I think you have a good grounding in the root microbiome and all these things that microbial populations can do. And we're going to shift to the human microbiome. Because in fact, we are just as coated and swathed with microbes inside and out as a plant's green body. Sure, we're not rooted in the soil, but microbes have other ways of getting in us and on us. And this is this whole burgeoning area that we call the human microbiome. And this is just to show you how explosive this field has been over about the last 20 years or so. Things really picked up maybe 7, 8 years ago, and it just continues to skyrocket. So you have everybody from gastroenterologists to microbiologists and everybody in between who's really taking a hard look at the human microbiome now. And part of the reason for that is we've learned just how microbial we are. The cells of our body, if you proportionately, there's at least one microbial cell for every one of our cells, and estimates go up to as high as 3 times as many microbial cells. Fungi, we probably have some Archaea in there. The estimate of our total number of genes is somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 million. And what we know about health and well-being is that what is going on with genes and with our environment and so on, it has a lot to do with our health. So this has been part of the reason that many scientists across different fields that touch on human biology are so interested in the microbiome. Suddenly, we're not who we think we are, and somebody else's genes are interacting with our genes and with our biology and with our bodies. And that leads to a place in the human body that I never thought I would get to know as intimately as this. The human colon, also known as the large intestine. And the reason the colon is so interesting for those who study the microbiome is that our bodies are really an ecosystem. And the heart of our ecosystem, where there's the most life, is our colons. And the reason for that, not surprisingly, we know microbes need to eat. Think about everything I was just talking about with the plant and its root microbiome and all of those exudates. The same thing is going on in our bodies, and the colon is a place where there are a lot of nutrients, because that's where everything we eat eventually ends up. So before we go, these next few slides are going to be sort of a deeper dive into the colon, but before I go there, I just want to let you know this term lumen, that's the central area of the colon where everything's moving through. And this is a 3-dimensional image. If you were to take a look at the colon wall, there's a thick layer of mucus. This is where most members of the microbiome live, because you live out here in the middle of the lumen, and the hydraulic forces are going to carry you out of there like a little twig in a flood of a river. So you hunker down in the mucus and you find your habitat, and that's where you live if you're a member of the microbiome. So what this is, this is an even more enlarged image of the colon wall. And so this is inside the colon, this is outside the colon. This is a cross section. So again, that central area, mucus, these are cells lining the colon. And out here, snugged up on the outside of the colon wall, it turns out, is where most of our immune system is. Immune cells and immune tissues. And this is interesting because why is so much of our immune system wrapped around our colon and our digestive tract? And that's what I'm going to unfold for you as we go on. And it starts with a dendritic cell, which is a type of an immune cell. And these cells, they are nosy, they are snoopy, they are surveilling, probably right now in all of us, what is up there in the colon habitat. What are the members of the microbiome doing? So this dendritic cell is sort of a shapeshifter. It can extend its arm in between 2 colon cells, and it goes up here, and it's collecting, it's on a fishing expedition in a way. It's collecting molecular samples of what is in the colon, and that could be anything from a bit of a sample from a bacterium, something that was in food. And this dendritic cell, it's not only sort of a collector of all of the information that it's reading in the colon, but it also shares that information with its pals, T cells. You've probably all heard of T cells. If you've, they're really, all of this precision medicine and genomic medicine, a lot of that is working with the human T cell to get it to do various things in disease treatments. So this dendritic cell is sharing that information with a T cell, because a T cell just sits around until it gets activated by a dendritic cell. And once it's activated, a T cell can do a number of different things, but overall, T cells are involved in the inflammatory process in our bodies. And inflammation mostly has a bad rap these days because a lot of people have too much inflammation going on and for too long of a time. So inflammation, it's normal, it's healthy. When, say, one of us picked up a flu bug here, let's say at this event. Your immune system, that's part of the inflammatory process. The dendritic cell's they're not just around your colon, they're elsewhere in your body. They're going to pick up on that. The T cell's going to get activated, and it's going to go after that virus and take it out. Any abnormal cell growth, that's the other thing that a T cell will take out. So it's this constant communication between dendritic cells, T cells, and now what we know from the microbiome is that all this stuff, all of this molecular sampling that the dendritic cells do, it's a form of intelligence in its own right that our immune system is relying on, not just for infectious kinds of microorganisms, but for other reasons as well that I'll go into. So the whole point here is that I think you catch the drift here. Information is up here, that information is collected, it's shared, and it sends T cells off onto their various missions in our body. And, right, so a problem, you want pro-inflammatory T cells fired up. When that problem is taken care of, the virus has got out, the abnormal cell growth is out, you want anti-inflammatory T cells to come back up. And day in, day out, you want this on a nice, even keel, is really what you want. You want both of these at the ready, just in case something is happening. And that is really our immune system's job. It is awake 24/7, 365, wondering what is going on in this body and what is my role as the immune system to keep it well and healthy. And so I think what this means, right, this is really the seat of our intelligence in many ways. All of this exchange that's going on between our gut microbiome and our immune system. And it turns out it's not just our immune system. Research increasingly is finding out that what's going on in the gut is affecting how we feel, if we're happy, if we're sad. There's a neurotransmitter called serotonin that is really important in how our brain works. And people used to think, oh, well, the serotonin is made up in the brain because that's where all of it's used. No, most of the serotonin is made in the gut. And researchers aren't quite sure if it's members of the microbiome that are producing the serotonin or if they're stimulating endocrine cells that are sort of packed in there among other cells lining the colon. But either way, the microbiome is influencing serotonin production. So this is sort of another part of our health and our well-being, and all of that intelligence is happening, there in the most ecologically rich place in the human body. All right, so how did we get to this point, though, that we've sort of missed this, and that many of us think about the immune system as it just goes and it knocks out pathogens, and that's what it's for. And because it's an entirely different thing to think about the microbiome as something that is this sort of information source between us and the external environment. But if you go way back in history, this is from 1664 in London, and it's some of the earliest epidemiological work. And so the theory was that they went around every week and they counted up everybody who died and why they died, because if you knew why people were dying, you could start preventing those causes of death. So this was early public health. And you look up here, okay, someone died of gout that week, one person. 3 people died of grief. Dropsy, 33, and so on. But you look at this number, in 1 week in London in that year, over 7,000 people died from plague. This is why we have the orientation that we do to the microbial world. Because the microbial world is double-edged, right? It can do things like this, but then it also is foundational to our health in many ways. And this is what's known as germ theory, and we looked at the entire microbial world through the lens of germ theory for a very, very long time, clear into the late 20th, early 21st century even. And now we're realizing that that's not really accurate. It's not representational of the whole microbial world. And so we had these various infectious diseases. This was saved more lives than probably anything in these years. We had antibiotics came onto the scene, and vaccines came onto the scene, and clean water came onto the scene. And between those three things, it did more to reduce premature deaths than probably anything else in human history. So this was considered progress and victory. And it was, and it is, if you're dealing with infectious diseases. But there's a whole lot of other diseases that around the same time period, post-war years, started going up and up and up. Multiple sclerosis, asthma, type 1 diabetes, and so on. It's not just these here on the slide, but it's also all of these various chronic conditions, many of which are also autoimmune. And so microbiome researchers have a theory about this, but also doctors and clinical researchers are like, why? How can it be that in one way we're living longer and we're really battling, doing a pretty good job at infectious diseases, but these other things are taking us out? And so the going theory among many microbiome research is this: are we missing some of our microbes? When you think about all of that communication and intelligence happening between the immune system and colon microbiota, this appears to be sort of the leading theory. And this still very much needs to be teased apart as to whether or not it's correlative or causal, but it's definitely associated, is what most researchers are thinking. And we know, so where are our microbes? Where did they go? Why are they missing? There's obvious things like inappropriate use of antibiotics. These are really powerful toxins, really, for bacteria and other microbes. So that's one thing, that's pretty obvious. But there's something else that's not quite so obvious, and it has to do with our diet. So with any ecosystem, all of the members of that ecosystem need to eat, right? And so our diet, it appears, is also a big factor in the changing human microbiome. And to understand why, you sort of have to take a quick trip down the digestive tract. And if you think of those major macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, all of those come in, they get broken down, and by about this point in the small intestine, all but one is sort of exited out. It's been broken down sufficiently, it's in the bloodstream, it's cruising around to where it's needed in your body. So that's fats, that's proteins, and that's simple carbohydrates or sugars. The one thing that does not leave the digestive tract at this point is the complex carbohydrates, the whole plant foods. So that is, like I just ate an apple about 2 hours ago, the whole plant food. That would be like the kale that I grow in our veg garden. That would be the whole wheat grain instead of the sugary inner endosperm part of a wheat grain. And so when you eat whole foods, turns out we do not have all the genes that code for the enzymes to break down the complex carbohydrates, also known as fiber. That's another term I'm sure you're familiar with. So they pass into our colon, but guess who does have the genome to make the enzymes to break all of this down? Members of our microbiome. And so that's what's going on in the colon, is that it's very much tranquil grazing pastures, really, for the microbiome here. And they are completely and thoroughly digesting these complex carbohydrates. And not only are they getting nutrients out of them, but their metabolites, just like with a plant, their metabolites, our body is then able to absorb. And there's research is showing many of these compounds that are produced in our colon have medicinal effects, because they then either they do their work right in the colon, or they can pass out of the colon into the bloodstream, and off they go to wherever they're needed in our body. So this is a completely different way of looking at your digestive tract, that you're really feeding something down here, and when you do, it's sort of part of your, what I always call it, the colon is not our onboard garbage can at all. It is really our onboard pharmacy. But to get those medicinal compounds out, we've got to feed the microbiome with an abundance of whole plant foods in our diet. And that's not to say exclusively, but it's to say a lot. So our diet has changed over time. In 1910, even up to now, 2018, we eat about the same amount of carbohydrates, but back in the day, they were mostly whole foods, carbohydrates that had not been processed into all of their constituent parts. Through time, you can see what's happened is we've gone, lots of carbs still, but we've busted up all of these foods, and so they're not in their whole form anymore. And an example, you take a whole grain, and I don't need to tell you everything that happens to a whole grain. It gets turned into all kinds of different foods that then come into our bodies. And the problem with it, it's not like a donut every Wednesday is going to do your microbiome in. But if the majority of your diet is mostly products made from various kinds of whole plant foods, no nourishment or nutrients ever really make it down to the microbiome. And that means your microbiome is down there going, hey, what about me? I'm a part of your body and I need nutrients too. So this is what researchers are cluing in on, is it's the change in the human diet over time and us simplifying the plant foods in our diet that is probably somewhat responsible for changes in the composition of our microbiome. Okay, so what we've got here, you've heard all this talk about microbes and these single-cell creatures, and they're hard to see. Well, this is a flock of bacteria, colorized just to make it easy for you to see, and they are running to the banquet table of fiber here in the human gut. That is what is going on. So there's ample fodder, is the whole point here. You constantly want to be making sure is that they're getting the fodder that they need. All right, let's put this together now. This is same deal as before. This is a cross-section through the gut. We've got the interior part of the gut, our microbiome, and out here is immune activity going on. Well, in comes the fiber. In comes that whole plant food. The microbiome is humming along, buzzing along, consuming all of that, and metabolites I mentioned. Well, one of the metabolites that the human microbiome can make, certain members of our microbiome, is a compound called butyrate. And butyrate is really interesting because it's made right there in the colon, right there next to those cells that line our colon, and it turns out that about somewhere around 80 or 90% of the energy that our colon cells consume to do their job, which is one of rapidly regenerating cells because the colon is a busy place, they get their energy from butyrate. This is a carbon-based compound. It's a short-chain fatty acid. And so we've got this, we've got this sort of internal thing going on where, yet again, a compound is being produced by a microbiome right where it's needed for the benefit of the host. So then I'll just go back to, our colon is not an onboard garbage can. It's way more like a medicine chest, so long as we feed it though, right? So, you know what a dendritic cell is. That's that nosy, snoopy type of an immune cell. Put one on the slide. It can slide up through here. It's always sampling. It gets a sample of butyrate. And it's like, oh, I'm going to go show this to my T cell team. It does. Butyrate activates T cells into anti-inflammatory T cells. So this is a good thing if you're a human being living in modern society where there's an excessive level of inflammation in our bodies. You want to be constantly getting back to that even keel between your pro-inflammatory forces and your anti-inflammatory forces. So this is sort of the communication and the intelligence, again, that's happening between the gut microbiota, and the rest of the human body. All right, another diet slide. Okay, so there's the human diet in this case. So we've got the standard Western diet. Basically, I'll just draw your attention here. The problem with the Western diet when it comes to the microbiome is this. You're starving your critters. The gut health diet, on the other hand, largest arrow, good metabolites, is what's happening here. They're getting fed, and it's not just butyrate that they're producing. It's estimated that at any one time in a person's body, somewhere around 40% of the compounds and molecules circulating were not made by our human cells. They were made by members of our microbiome. So that's a lot of chemistry that our microbiome is responsible for, and a lot of that chemistry influences our well-being. And we go into this more in the book, and so I'll not say more about it here. So here we are. This is really the new view of our gut. We should really be thinking of gardening our gut, because it's an ecosystem after all. And we know the kinds of things that most of the critters in that ecosystem are after and what they do well on. And when they do well, we do well. It's sort of like in the farming community, often you hear if the land is well, then the people are well. This is our internal landscape in many ways. So when it's well, then we are. All right, so it's been, I think Dave possibly mentioned this. We're working on a 4th book project, believe it or not, 3 books about dirt and soil and farming and food and health. And we never really, in any of those books, took a really deep dive into this question of, we know that it matters what we eat. I just went through all of that about the difference between simple and complex carbohydrates. But what is the role in the agronomic system that produces our food? It turns out that some members of the microbiome can ferment phytochemicals. So these are things like beta-carotene or anthocyanins or the flavonoids that all plants produce. And some of these phytochemicals are food for our microbiome. So we want these phytochemicals to be dense in our crops, and we want other nutrients to be dense as well. So we're going to take a deep dive because we want to connect soil health to plant or crop health, to the health of the animals, cows, sheep, and so on, that are eating those plants, and to the health of the people that are eating those plants and animals. So you can think about it as, you know, what your food ate is sort of how we think about it, and its importance to our health in many ways. All right, we're nearly at time here, and that's a good thing, because here's your takeaways. When it comes to the root and the gut, really, these are 2 parallel systems, and if you were to turn a root inside out, pull all those root hairs, put them on the inside, it's sort of, in a big picture, kind of fuzzy-eyed way, it's a lot like the human gut. And when it comes to microbiomes, they're especially parallel because of all of the nutrient acquisition and processing that goes on. Been nattering on and on about microbial metabolites. This is another basic piece of this story. Immunity and defense. Our microbiome is a big player in that, in our bodies, and also in the botanical world. And lastly, immunity and defense comes from intelligence, right? And the language of that intelligence is the metabolites and the nutrients that feed all into that. Okay, and later on, maybe you're back with family or friends, or in 20 minutes you're like, phew, I don't even know what to think, my head is spinning. Well, there's only 6 words you really need to remember, because we boiled it down to that. And it goes like this: mulch your soil inside and out. That's what it comes down to.